Vince Gill has never been one to talk about the past. For decades, he's let the music do it for him. But lately one name keeps returning to his lips. Patty Loveless. The woman whose voice matched his heartbreak, whose silence said more than any love song ever could. They were never a couple, yet their chemistry defined an era of country music. Every time their voices met, something in the room changed. You could feel it, something unspoken, something sacred. Nashville called it harmony, fans called it fate, Vince called it a blessing. Now at 68 he's finally ready to explain why he's kept that bond so private for so long. What really tied him to Patty Loveless, and why after all these years can he still not speak of her without emotion breaking through his voice. It was the early 1990s, and country music was in the middle of a transformation. Steel guitars still ruled, but pop influences were creeping in. New artists were flooding Nashville, each fighting for a voice that could cut through the noise. Vince Gill already had his. He was known for songs that ached, lyrics that lingered, and a tone so pure it could quiet a room. Patty Loveless was rising fast, carrying the mountain soul of Kentucky in every note. When their paths crossed backstage at an award show, neither could have known it would mark the beginning of one of country music's most powerful pairings. They first shared a stage soon after. No press build-up, no spectacle, just two voices finding each other in perfect balance. The crowd noticed before they did. Vince sang with precision, Patty with fire. When they met in the middle, it sounded like memory and prophecy blended into one. Industry insiders leaned forward, stunned by the chemistry. This wasn't just another duet. It felt like something meant to last. What drew them together wasn't romance, but recognition. Both had grown up in small southern towns, both shaped by gospel harmonies and heartache. They knew what it meant to struggle, to fight for a place in an industry that often forgot its roots. That shared history became the thread that bound their sound. Vince later said it was like singing with someone who already understood what he was trying to say before he said it. After that night, invitations poured in. They sang together on television specials, charity concerts, and impromptu appearances at the Opry. Each time the connection deepened. There was no plan, no publicity push, just an unspoken understanding that their voices were better together. Fans began to crave their duets more than their solo performances. Even other artists started to talk about it. One veteran producer called their blend light and shadow meeting halfway. What made it unforgettable wasn't just harmony. It was the emotion underneath. Patty's voice carried the ache of the mountains, the hard-won grace of her upbringing. Vince's carried regret and compassion, the weight of every story he'd ever sung. Together they built something spiritual. When Vince leaned into a line, Patty lifted it. When her voice trembled, his steadied her. It was music as partnership, not performance. By the end of that season, Nashville knew they had found something rare. Their names started appearing together on award ballots and liner notes. But beyond the spotlight, there was something gentler, respect, gratitude, and a quiet sense that they had found in each other what every artist longs for: someone who truly listens. Neither spoke about it publicly, and maybe that silence was part of the magic. Theirs wasn't a story told in interviews or gossip columns. It was written in songs, rehearsals, and the space between two voices that understood each other perfectly. What began as one performance had turned into a bond that would outlast the fame surrounding it and change both their lives forever. By 1991, Vince Gill was everywhere: radio, award stages, late-night television. His songs weren't just hits, they felt like confessions. Patty Loveless, meanwhile, had carved her place with that haunting Appalachian tone that could turn any lyric into truth. They'd both been in Nashville long enough to know how fleeting success could be. But on one quiet rehearsal afternoon, before an industry showcase, everything changed. They were scheduled to sing together for the first time. The room was nearly empty, just a few musicians, a soundboard, and two microphones. Vince strummed a few soft chords, testing the key. Patty joined in, her voice floating above his guitar, and suddenly the air shifted. The engineer stopped moving. Even the chatter in the hallway faded. What came from that rehearsal wasn't just a blend of voices, it was the discovery of something rare. Two artists who sounded more honest together than alone. Afterward, Vince walked away quietly, almost shaken. He knew what he'd heard. Patty did too. Neither said much. In an industry full of ego and noise, they'd stumbled upon something simple and sacred. Their harmony carried the ache of gospel choirs, front porch hymns, and small-town heartbreak. It wasn't planned, and it couldn't be replicated. When they performed that same song live a week later, the crowd rose halfway through. No pyrotechnics, no band solos, just two voices meeting perfectly in the middle. Critics called it chemistry, but it was more than that. It was connection without explanation. Vince's precision met Patty's emotion, like two halves of one story. It was the sound of trust rare in country music, rarer still between two stars. After the show, the whispers began. Nashville's insiders knew what they'd witnessed. Executives wanted them on stage together again. Artists began comparing their duets to the greats, George and Tammy, Conway and Loretta. But Vince and Patty had something different. There was no drama, no rivalry, just deep respect. He'd found someone who understood the quiet side of fame, the loneliness between applause, the cost of perfection. That night sparked a partnership that would grow without needing labels or promises. They didn't over-explain it, and maybe that's why it lasted. Years later, when fans looked back on the great duets of the era, one truth stood out: Vince Gill and Patty Loveless didn't chase the spotlight. They met in it, and that first rehearsal, barely noticed by anyone else, had given country music one of its purest pairings. Their story wasn't about falling in love. It was about finding balance. Two voices carrying the same message from the same hills, for audiences who still believed that country music could heal. It was the night that changed everything, even if the world wouldn't understand why until much later. When Vince Gill and Patty Loveless began performing together, it didn't feel like a career move. It felt inevitable. Nashville was crowded with talent in the early 90s, yet somehow these two voices rose above the noise. When they stood side by side, the air seemed to tighten. Vince carried the warmth of a storyteller. Patty brought the ache of the mountains. The result was harmony so natural it sounded older than either of them. Their early duets weren't chart-chasing singles. They were moments, raw, spontaneous, and unforgettable. They sang as if they'd rehearsed for years, though most of the time they hadn't. Vince would glance over mid-song, and Patty would know exactly where to take it next. They anticipated each other, the way family singers once did around kitchen tables. Theirs was that rare kind of musical telepathy that couldn't be taught or rehearsed. Backstage, they were opposites. Vince was open, soft-spoken, known for his gentle humor. Patty was quieter, focused, often lost in her own thoughts before a show. Yet together, those differences worked. He steadied her, she grounded him. When nerves hit before a big performance, Vince often said all he needed was to hear Patty start the harmony, then everything would fall into place. Fans began to notice the consistency of their connection. Every award show, every benefit concert, they brought the same calm intensity. No theatrics, no forced smiles, just mutual trust. When Vince performed alone, audiences waited to see if Patty would appear. When she did, applause would start before she even sang a note. In private, they talked little about success. Both had seen the cost of fame. Both had lost people along the way. Mentors, friends, even parts of themselves to the grind of touring. Maybe that's why their bond ran so deep. It wasn't built on ambition, it was built on understanding. Vince often said that when he sang with her, it reminded him why he'd fallen in love with country music in the first place. Theirs wasn't the kind of friendship that demanded attention. They didn't dine together in public or give joint interviews. But when they stepped into a studio or onto a stage, They became a single sound, his smooth tenor finding her rough edges, her tremble adding truth to his polish. Nashville had seen duos come and go, but nothing like this. By the time critics began calling their blend the soul of modern country, both had already moved on to other projects, but neither could shake what they'd created together. Years later, when fans replayed those early performances, it was clear what made them timeless: honesty. Vince and Patty didn't chase trends, they chased feeling. And every time their voices met, the audience felt it too. By 1992, Nashville had started treating Vince Gill and Patty Loveless as more than duet partners. They'd become a phenomenon. Their performances didn't just sound good, they felt lived in. When they shared a stage, even the loudest crowds went still, as if waiting for something holy to happen. Producers wanted to capture that energy in the studio, but Vince and Patty resisted making it formulaic. They knew it couldn't be recreated under pressure. What made their sound powerful wasn't technique, it was trust. Vince's phrasing carried years of heartbreak, and Patty's tone turned it into release. Together they made pain sound beautiful. Behind the scenes they worked in near silence. A nod from Vince was enough for Patty to find the harmony. A half smile from her told him the take was right. They didn't chase perfection, they chased truth. When the session ended, no one wanted to leave. Engineers and musicians often stayed just to listen to playback, knowing they'd heard something that might never happen again. Critics began comparing them to the greats, but their bond stayed personal. They never promoted themselves as a duo, never sold the image. For Vince, who had weathered loss and rebuilding, Patty's steadiness became an anchor. For her, his warmth reminded her why she'd chosen music in the first place. As the years passed, the songs deepened. When Vince released "When I Call Your Name," Patty's voice echoed in listeners' minds even when she wasn't on the record. When she recorded "You Don't Even Know Who I Am," fans heard traces of the same ache they shared on stage. Without realizing it, they had started writing two halves of the same emotional story. What set them apart was restraint. They didn't force collaboration or feed rumors. Instead, they waited until the moment felt right. Each performance became its own chapter, a short meeting of souls that didn't need explaining. For audiences, it was magic. For them, it was understanding. By the mid-90s, their connection had become part of country music's identity, two voices that reminded people of everything the genre was meant to be: honest, humble, and human. By the late 1990s, their paths began to pull in different directions. Vince was everywhere, touring, collecting awards, collaborating with rock legends. Patty started stepping back, drawn to the quieter life she'd always wanted. Fame had never been her goal. Peace was. Yet even as their careers drifted apart, their voices refused to let go of each other. When Vince lost people close to him, Patty was never far. She didn't speak publicly, but she showed up when it mattered, standing beside him at memorials, blending her harmony into songs meant to comfort the grieving. Their duets began to feel less like performances and more like prayers. Fans could sense it. There was grief in Vince's tone and faith in Patty's, meeting halfway in a place only they seemed to understand. Nashville called them timeless, but time was exactly what they were running out of. The country sound they'd helped preserve was fading under the weight of new trends. Still, they kept returning to each other's stages, quietly protecting what they'd built. People wondered why they never made a joint album, never tried to cash in on what everyone else saw as gold. But that was the point. What they had wasn't for sale. It was private, preserved in live moments that couldn't be streamed or duplicated. Even younger artists began to take notice. Many said watching them together was like seeing an older language spoken fluently, one that modern country had almost forgotten. Patty called it grace. Vince called it friendship. Whatever it was, it ran deeper than music. Every reunion reminded fans how rare their connection was. When they sang "Go Rest High on That Mountain" years later, it wasn't nostalgia, it was testimony. Their voices had aged, softened, but the feeling hadn't changed. They'd grown into the very stories they once sang, and every line carried the weight of everything left unsaid. By the time Vince Gill entered his 60s, his career had already earned him every award Nashville could offer. Yet when people asked about his proudest moments, he never mentioned trophies. He talked about voices, and one name always slipped through: Patty Loveless. Their paths had crossed for over 3 decades, but something about those later years made the connection even clearer. The flash of fame had faded, leaving only what was real. When they appeared together at small tributes or benefit shows, there was no showmanship left, just two veterans doing what they'd always done best: feel every note. The bond they shared had matured. They no longer needed to prove anything, to themselves or to anyone else. When Vince spoke about his faith, Patty's name often surfaced. He said she reminded him of where he came from, of the days when country music still felt like church, humble, raw, and human. For her, Vince represented grace under pressure. He'd endured tragedy, career shifts, and personal loss, yet never lost the kindness that made him beloved in the first place. When Patty stepped away from touring, many assumed her story was over, but each time Vince performed a song tied to faith or farewell, her harmony would reappear on stage, in memory, or in tribute. That invisible thread between them never frayed. Younger singers often looked to them as proof that collaboration didn't need drama to be powerful. Their story became a quiet lesson: real connection doesn't fade with distance, it deepens. Vince once told an interviewer that music had a way of returning the people you need, right when you need them most. He never said her name, but everyone knew. As years passed, their appearances grew rarer, which only made them more cherished. The audiences came for nostalgia, but they stayed for something else: a reminder that harmony, when genuine, can outlive every season of fame. And standing together under the stage lights, two old friends from Kentucky proved it one more time. By the time Vince Gill and Patty Loveless reunited for the CMA stage in 2023, decades of quiet loyalty stood behind them. To the crowd it looked like nostalgia. To Vince it felt like unfinished business. He had spent years letting songs speak for him, but some feelings refused to stay buried in melody. Age had softened both their voices, yet when they sang together again, the tone of their youth returned for a moment. That mix of fragility and strength carried a truth words never could. They had lived through everything the songs predicted: success, loss, survival. When Vince looked at Patty mid-performance, there was gratitude more than longing, an unspoken thank you for all the years she'd shown up when it mattered most. Patty hadn't chased fame in years, but she hadn't disappeared either. She chose the quiet road: family, faith, the mountains that raised her. Still, every time she joined Vince, the audience remembered why she mattered. He often said the best singers don't just hit notes, they heal people. And Patty did that for him. That night, as the final chord faded, Vince didn't speak. He didn't need to. The silence between them told the story: a lifetime of friendship, shaped by music, sealed in harmony that outlasted everything else. After the performance, Vince Gill did something he'd avoided his entire career. He spoke plainly about Patty Loveless. No stage script, no deflection, just truth. He called her one of the few artists who could turn a song into a prayer, someone who carried the old soul of country when everyone else was chasing charts. For years he deflected questions about their bond. That night, the silence ended. He didn't describe her as a collaborator, or even a friend, but as a constant. When he lost his father, when Keith Whitley died, when fame began to feel hollow, Patty was there. Sometimes in person, sometimes just through her voice on the radio. She didn't comfort him with words, she sang. He said that's how she's always done it, without needing attention or thanks. Patty, when asked later, only smiled. She said Vince never needed to explain anything. Their story had always been in the music. and maybe that's why it lasted. While others sought headlines, they built legacy. Two artists who never let ego cloud the work, who treated harmony as something sacred. By speaking her name after decades of silence, Vince gave fans what they'd long felt but never heard confirmed: that Patty Loveless wasn't just part of his career, she was part of his soul. In the weeks after that CMA night, clips of Vince and Patty flooded the internet. Younger audiences discovered them for the first time, drawn to the simplicity of what they'd shared. There were no flashing lights, no special effects, just two voices carrying decades of history. For longtime fans, it felt like closure. For Vince, it felt like peace. He didn't grant interviews afterward. The performance had said enough. Those close to him noticed a change, a quiet contentment, as if he'd finally unburdened something he'd carried too long. He'd spent a lifetime giving emotion to other people's stories, but that song, with Patty by his side, had finally told his own. Patty returned to her life in the mountains, away from headlines, but she carried that moment too. Friends said she called it the right ending to a long chapter. They'd never needed to explain their connection. The truth had always been there in the way they looked at each other when the music faded. For fans, their reunion wasn't just nostalgia, it was a reminder of what country music once stood for: loyalty, faith, and sincerity that didn't need explanation. Vince had finally broken his silence, not with confession, but with gratitude. And for Patty Loveless, that was enough. For more emotional stories, check out this video.